Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This week on the show, we're talking about INTJs and careers. So if you're an INTJ listening along or you've got an INTJ in your life, welcome to the show. This is going to be a very interesting conversation today. We're actually talking about careers and particularly about INTJs because we're in the middle of running our mentorship program called Personality Life Path Mentorship. This is designed to understand not just how you're wired in your personality, but to chart the pathway forward in your life. And we're working with students right now going through all of the cognitive functions, the Jungian cognitive functions. There's 8 of them, 4 learning and 4 decision-making functions. Each of them, we believe, represents an archetypical energy, both in the world, generally around us, but also inside of our personalities. We have to interface with all these parts of the world. So we're walking students through over 8 weeks. We're taking one function a week, and we're exploring how that function and its energy shows up in your life. And we're giving exercises, and then we're reporting back on the next call the following week to, okay, how did that feel in your life? Where does it show? What do you need more of, less of? What's your relationship to this? And we're walking through all 8 of them. In the midst of this program, though, and it's going to come up with a live ending event that we're going to connect all this for a life path forward, making a plan for your life as a student. As we're talking with students about this, transitions keep coming up. In fact, I think most students are part of this program because they're in a transition moment of their life. A few people are in relationship transitions, either starting out in a new relationship or they're reevaluating one they've been in. There's some people altering the life path that they're on. Maybe they're going, I'm not living the life path that's my life path. I'm on somebody else's life path. I want my own life path. And many people are reporting a transition moment in their career. And we saw this come up so many times, we thought, well, let's take a moment and record a series of podcasts talking about each of the 16 Myers-Briggs types and their relationship to career. Today, we're talking about INTJ. So as we get into this, we're going to introduce this concept today, both at a more accessible level if you're new to type, but also at a deeper level if you're a type geek, on what's called personality subtypes. Tony, maybe just give us a broad brush and then we can go into detail right after that.
Yeah, and we also, after we talk a little bit about what these subtypes are, we did a full podcast with our friend and colleague, Dr. Dario Nardi, who introduced properly this idea of subtypes in a complete podcast. So if you're interested in going further down this rabbit's hole, I highly recommend checking that one out.
Is this an improper use of subtypes today?
Is it? Is it
you
improper?
said he introduced it properly.
Well, I meant like he did an entire hour.
I know what you meant. I was
introducing the concept, whereas we're just going to touch on it and move on. We're actually going to use it as a framework for the conversation because while it appears as if our Myers-Briggs type is pre-wired inside of us, so we kind of come out of the blister packaging with our type, our subtype is more nurture. And one of the major influences on how we are wired with our subtype is the career we choose, right? The thing we spend 40 plus hours a week doing is going to alter how our brains are, wired to respond to the environment. So the reason why subtypes and careers are such a natural marriage is that they impact each other very much so. So our type impacts the things we're interested in and the careers we're likely to choose. And then the careers we actually do choose impact the flavor of our type that we're going to manifest as. And this changes and alters over time. So if we go through these different subtypes and it's very common for a person to say, oh, I kind of see myself in 1 or 2 of those, or maybe even all 4, you might be right. You might have lived long enough and experienced enough life that you have traveled through all 4 of these subtypes.
Okay. But before we get into any of the subtype stuff, I just want to talk about the internet. What it tells INTJs are the top 10 careers. Now, this is according to the internet. This isn't me. So if you're an INTJ and you go to the internet for your advice, this is the advice, or at least the list that the internet would give you based on my casual research. Number 1, top INTJ career, scientist. Number 2, engineer. Number 3, attorney or lawyer. Number 4, architect. Number 5, management consultant. Seems fitting, right? Number 6, software developer. 7, professor or teacher. 8, physician, surgeon. 9, financial analyst. And 10, executive or COO or CEO. That seems like a list that I think a lot of INTJs would resonate with. There's some stereotypes on the list, right, Antonia? But yeah, I can see a lot of INTJs going toward those types of careers.
Usually these lists, every week that we do a different type, that top 10 list is usually pretty solid.
Yeah.
But I have seen a trend that depending upon the subtype of INTJ that you must identify with, some of those careers are going to be more attractive and some are going to be kind of horrifying to think about. So not every INTJ is going to end up with all 10 of the, or like being attracted to all 10 of those careers. I will say though, there are also career paths that aren't on that list that I think are very attractive to some subtypes.
And we'll talk about those when we get into each of the subtypes. Okay, so these subtypes came from Dr. Dario Nardi's work. He still is, in his laboratory, he's connecting different personality types to EEG machines. He's watching the brain patterns show up and he's noticing trends in type. And he started to notice when he connected EEG machines to INTJs, they were showing up with 4 basic brain patterns. And then he started to look and compare this to Dr. Helen Fisher's work in neurotransmitters, and also noticed a crossover in chemicals, in the neurotransmitter chemicals that these subtypes might be attracted to. So in the laboratory, knowing somebody's an INTJ, watching the brain scans come up, he developed this quadrant of 4 personality subtypes based on every main, Myers-Briggs type. Those are, I'll just list them really quick and we'll go into all of them right now. It's a dominant INTJ, creative INTJ, normalizing INTJ, and harmonizing INTJ. We'll talk about these in a very accessible way, just in case you're new to type, but we're also going to go a little deeper into the cognitive functions and the attunement of those, and talk a little bit about the neurotransmitters as well. If you're a type geek and you want to know some of the math underneath the conclusions that we've come to. Oh, he also borrowed these words, the dominant, creative, normalizing, and harmonizing. If you're a student or if you've read something from Socionics, these are the same terms that Dr. Victor Galenko uses in Socionics. And so Dario asked him if he could use the same names for these subtypes.
Yeah, they're really solid names too, because I think they do a really good job of describing some of the key characteristics of each of the subtypes.
So let's jump into the dominant INTJ subtype first. What does this subtype look like? So
the dominant INTJ is, you kind of get the flavor from the word itself. This is a more assertive INTJ. They're relatively fast reacting. So again, we're comparing this subtype to other INTJs.
Baseline is INTJ at the end of the day.
Exactly. So remember that we're still talking about somebody with those type preferences, but in comparison to other INTJs, they are relatively fast reacting. And in some ways, it's because they've worked things out already. Primarily what they've worked out is how to balance situational demands versus their values and a desire for things being smooth or absolute. So some INTJs struggle with this in a situation that requires them to come to quicker conclusions. They're not sure how they feel about it. They're not sure if whether or not this is going to align with their values. They're not sure if this is going to end up as smooth as they would like. And that is oftentimes what creates the hiccups or the slowing down of the reaction speed. But these INTJs have almost sort of put it in the hopper, right? They've already figured out how to react and respond to environmental requests and also balance it with those things that usually create a throttle. And that's in part why they are so dominant. It's part of the reason why their energy pushes forward into the world and they have more assertiveness, is because that's a big piece of what they've figured out.
I think most INTJs would identify with this idea of being very process-oriented, focused on measuring twice or 3 times and cutting once. This INTJ is very results-focused. Mm-hmm. What is the end point? What is the result I'm going for? Not just the process to get there.
You got it. That's right. And because of that, they generally make more skilled managers and executives. They lean really hard on analytic skills, particularly language-based reasoning. So this is a big part of why they're able to work things out, like I mentioned, almost figuring it out before they even have to get there. And in Linda Barron's vernacular, they have an in-charge style. They, though, sacrifice some of the brainstorming starburst pattern. So it's not uncommon for INTJs to identify with brainstorming, but this is a type of INTJ that won't. They're a little bit more focused on executive powers, on pre-thinking, on figuring things out before they get there. And so because of that, they're not as good at unstructured creativity.
Yeah, these are the getting things done INTJs. Let's get it done.
Right, exactly. So if they do some of that figuring it out, they're going to do that alone in quiet times by themselves, but they're not going to be as mentioned, attracted to unstructured creativity. They've likely built some of these in more traditional institutions. So it's not uncommon to find, more dominant INTJs in like the military and hospitals, engineering firms, software houses, places where they've really had to step up and take charge and lead. And they're usually in more conventional office spaces. So they're less entrepreneurial, actually. They're more likely to be leading something than they are to be envisioning something and leading people towards that vision. They are good at speaking and listening. And so that's a major part of what they bring to leadership, is that capacity for speaking and leading, or speaking and listening. And they're very good at separating work from play. So their work is their work environment. That's where they bring all their assertiveness. But at the end of the day, they're introverts still. And so a lot of times those strong executive capacities, those characteristics they've built, they require an effortful learning curve, right? They put some time and effort into that. They figured it out. And that's what gives them these qualities. But they're still introverts. They're still going to need that alone time. And so outside of work, they usually are pretty quiet. That's when they're getting their alone time. That's when they're getting their introversion. They're less visual than other INTJs. They tend to be more auditory. So when they're having alone time, they're probably consuming audiobooks or podcasts, that sort of thing. And they have a strong reflective side because, again, they're still INTJs. So when they're not on at work, they are more open to the esoteric, to musings, to things that maybe people at work would be surprised that they're into.
Yeah. So this INTJ is not only okay with hierarchy, they actually prefer it because they want to be at the top of the hierarchy. They would like to be in charge, most likely. These are the leaders, the managers of our world. The INTJ that likes to be in charge, maybe start that company and run that company. I think this is that style here. And so they're totally, I think, okay with a pecking order and all of that top-down structure with a desire to move up the chain of command to the top.
Yeah, exactly. Again, they're not as entrepreneurial. So they're not as likely to be the person who started the company. But like you mentioned, they are usually pretty good at working their way to the top of the food chain.
Yeah.
So some of the careers that attract them. Now, of course, this is not a comprehensive list. This is just gives you an idea of the kinds of careers that help create this style of thinking, but that also a dominant INTJ is going to be attracted to.
Yeah.
So this list will be unsurprising. At the top is a CEO, a chief executive officer. Number 2 is chief technology officer. 3 is a military strategist. 4 is research and development director. 5 is project manager. There's also on the list systems engineer, data analyst, business analyst, operations manager, supply chain manager, software architect, IT manager, financial analyst, policy analyst, and organizational consultant.
I see a lot of managers in there, which would make sense.
And analysts.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this might mistype for an ENTJ, ESTJ, maybe even a more reserved ENFP, somebody that's like taking charge. It's very creative, but very taking charge, looking for results. They might throw the typing off if you're this style.
Yeah.
Because this isn't a typical, I wouldn't say this is the stereotypical INTJ framework.
No, I think this INTJ is not going to identify with the slow decision-making piece as much. And so they are more likely to, if they are going to mistype as somebody who's leading with extroverted thinking, or like you said, an ETJ type.
Yeah.
And because they're not as into brainstorming, like you mentioned, they could easily mistype as an ESTJ or an ENTJ. That said, that desire and craving for alone time all the time might be the thing that makes them finally, or like at the end of the search, go, no, I have INTJ preferences.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of which, we promised we'd leave it accessible to newbies, but also dive into the more technical piece.
Yeah. So the cognitive functions an INTJ is using, they're learning information with their driver or dominant process of introverted intuition. It's an intuitive process. We've nicknamed it perspectives. It's shifting perspectives to understand the world. And then they make their decisions with their co-pilot or auxiliary of extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. This is about getting results by the numbers, making something happen in the outer world, extroverting the thinking. Mm-hmm. So these two functions are how an INTJ moves through their world. And the attunement of these two functions is what creates the subtype. So each of these functions can be attuned a little differently, and that's how we get the subtype. So we're still talking about the same two functions, just the way they're expressed. How does this look for a dominant INTJ?
Yeah. So as mentioned, we go into this a little bit more in the podcast we recorded with Dario. So please feel free to go check it out if you want to go further down the rabbit's hole. But just as a sort of a callback to that episode, each function, each cognitive function can have what's called an analytic or a holistic preference. The analytic preference of a function is going to be more assertive. It's more targeted. It has an energy that is quite focused and wants to create an impact, really. It's more targeted, almost like you're focused on a single, end game or end result, regardless of what the function is. The holistic version of a function is the opposite. It's more diffused. It's less targeted, but it also takes in more of a peripheral. So if you think about focusing on, I think of it as two different styles of meditation. When you meditate on a single point in the wall, you're hyper-focused on it, but you can't really see anything in your peripheral. That's more of the analytic bent. A more holistic version would be like Shambhala meditation, which encourages you to lid your eyes. So you can't really focus on anything in front of you, but you see a lot in the peripheral.
Yeah.
Those are two different styles of vision. And I would say that there are good metaphors for the two different styles of how a function can show up. So keeping that in mind, when we're talking about the dominant INTJ subtype, it means both of their preferred functions, both introverted intuition and perspectives and extroverted thinking or effectiveness, both of those have an analytic bent. They're both assertive. They both have that focus and that energy pushing out, more of trying to make an impact on the environment as opposed to being influenced by it. And that makes sense. That makes sense that would create a dominant INTJ.
Well, and it would also make sense the neurotransmitter associated with it, which is testosterone. That's the preferred chemical that this subtype is chasing all the time. And so that analytic, that drive forward mixed with the neurotransmitter creates the dominant subtype. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the creative INTJ subtype. What are the characteristics of this subtype and some of the careers?
So creative INTJs, Dario indicates, is probably the most common, interestingly enough. And it also explains why there are so many people out there who cannot tell if they're INTJs or INTPs. Because as I read the INTJ creative description, you could see why a lot of people with this preference think that they might be perceivers, because it's lots of crossover. So this kind of INTJ tends to be creative in a thoughtful way, though they're also somewhat scattered and they're more generalists than specialists. So unlike some other INTJ types that we'll talk about, this is the more generalist INTJ. They like to stir the pot. They like to engage other people. They like to entertain. And in Linda Barron's vernacular, they get things going. That's their style. So there's that little bit of chaos making, which is really fascinating for an INTJ and why they might think that they're perceivers. They have unlike the dominant INTJ that doesn't have a strong or very much of a starburst at all, that brainstorming, that sort of creative, unstructured creativity, the creative INTJ is the exact opposite. They have a very strong, solid starburst pattern that's typical of that creativity, typical of the unstructuredness. They take in data and quickly play with it. And to balance that chaos, because they still are judgers, right? So they still have INTJ preferences. To balance that chaos, they also lean on parts of their mind that allow them to organize, to present, to act on thoughts, and have a goal focus orientation. So they're taking that unstructured creativity, but then they're putting it towards something that has a goal orientation to it in order for it to not be total chaos machine. They easily notice patterns. They project into the future how an idea or an event is going to turn out, which is pretty common for anybody using introverted intuition. And then they create a goal as an organizing principle around it. There's the common INTJ weakness, though. They're the ones who are going to show up with the basic INTJ weakness of having mediocre body awareness, a repressed emotional life, right? Some of the things that we tend to think of with stereotypes around INTJs, because they have a tendency to neglect those parts of their brain regions, the parts that are about identity and values and understanding other people's feelings. And so as they grow and mature, those are areas that they're going to want to tap into and be a little bit more connected to. And unlike some other creative subtypes, though, this is what's interesting, is some creative subtypes have a real difficult time getting themselves going. Like motivation comes in spurts. For INTJs, they actually end up pushing themselves. So they're INTJs that tend to have a little bit more internal motivation than maybe other creative subtypes. They are also introverts, though. And so anytime they're doing something that's an executive task, so that could be defined as decision-making, juggling new information, managing other people's, or other people in general, that might take some effort. Unlike the dominant INTJ that's worked some of that out, the creative INTJ has not done that as much. And so that has mixed results. They're not as good at managing and leading other people. They're a little bit more iconoclastic, a little bit more doing their own creative thing. And because of their more chaos orientation, not that I keep using that word. I think it's actually not the right word.
Free form.
Yes. Thank you.
Go with the flow, free form energy.
Thank you.
INTJ.
That is a better word, because I think every time I use the word chaos, I'm going to make all the INTJs kind of like go,
lose their mind.
Lose it, right? The free flowing, free form energy of this style of INTJ, again, makes them generalists, but they're motivated. They're not just a jack of all trades, but they actually really like to set up goals and hit them. They, unlike some other INTJ subtypes, are going to not have a clear distinction or delineation between work and hobbies. They're going to merge them together. In fact, if they can, they're going to try to make them the same thing. Yeah. So every time a creative INTJ has a hobby, they're probably going to be thinking, how do I make money from this? Or if they have to go get a day job, they're going to ask, how do I bring all of my hobbies and my interests into my day job? Or they might have a bunch of side gigs. They might have a day job, but a whole bunch of side hustles going on where they're trying to merge their interests and get some ROI or return on investment from it. And they need to, even though they're motivated, their number one need isn't in motivation, it's in self-management. So it's in disciplining the self. So they're motivated, they're into a whole bunch of stuff, but they might lack some self-discipline in order to really sort of stick the landing, so to speak. And so that's along with body awareness and being really in touch with identity, that might be the big hurdle that they have to really work on. But otherwise, they're really interesting people. They're very interesting conversationalists. They're interesting partners. Yeah. And they benefit from people in their lives helping them on that path of self-discipline.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the careers they might choose, some of the careers they might be leaning toward, and then we'll talk about the deeper wiring.
Okay. All right. So this list it really taps into the INTJ's ability to notice patterns, right? That starburst capacity to project future outcomes, to set goals, and also explore more that visual, reflective side. And these INTJs, by the way, I didn't mention this, they tend to be highly visual. Unlike the dominant that's very auditory, this is an INTJ that tends to be quite visual. So on the list that will capitalize on some of those elements are architect, industrial designer, urban planner, art curator with a focus on innovative or futuristic exhibits. So I thought that was a really interesting direction for an INTJ. Creative director, marketing strategist, user experience designer or UX designer, product designer, game designer or concept artist. So like a concept artist for films, video games, or animations. Science writer or journalist, exhibition designer, visual effects supervisor, robotics engineer, AI researcher, or film or TV producer.
These are very adaptable career choices. Many of these you have to kind of figure out the way through. They're not just cut and dry. You got to kind of get on the path and kind of go, like figure it out as you go.
Yeah.
Creatively, quite frankly. So
I've noticed that pattern, by the way, for all the creative subtypes is this merging of interests and career. Mm-hmm. I think when creative subtypes can really figure out how to do that, how to get the things that they're just naturally, like the rabbit's holes that they're naturally chasing, to be able to bring that into a career context, I think that's sort of the holy grail.
Yeah. So if the dominant INTJ subtype is okay with hierarchy, okay with working the management side of things, working up the ladder, giving direction and leading and guiding, this creative is a little more free form. And so we've been talking a lot about, with all the creative subtypes, and for INTJs, it's no different. Platform thinking can be so helpful here. What do I mean by platform thinking? Well, Uber is a platform. YouTube is a platform. Substack is a platform. Etsy is a platform. These are places that you can create things. Udemy, right? All these kinds of things. You can create things and then you can distribute them by using a platform, ad revenue or direct sales or something like that. And what's great about a creative subtype tapping into a platform is the platform handles all the structure, all the nitpicky paperwork, all the getting paid and paying other people, all the things that as a creative subtype you probably don't want to attend to, even though you as an INTJ probably could be totally capable of it, but you're just wanting to apply yourself to creative things. So if you're this subtype, I would start thinking like, what platforms can I associate with? Where can I connect to a bunch of platforms? They could also be people platforms, networks of people you associate with that can help get your creativity out there. They can help support that creativity in the world for you.
Yeah. And entrepreneur is not on this list. I don't think it actually made it to any of the INTJ lists, interestingly enough. But I would say that the creative INTJ is probably the most likely to become entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
For the reasons you mentioned, in order to have their own platform. And they're the stir the pot INTJ. They're the ones that are a little bit more willing to question social norms, like in a bigger way, not just in a have my own say in my heart or have my say in my head, but actually really truly push against society norms. And so, like you mentioned, having platforms or things that support you help and keep you accountable, right? It's sometimes difficult to be a creative subtype because it's not uncommon for them to have motivation and drive, but lack that discipline.
Yeah.
And sometimes these contexts, like you're talking about, the platforms that are already there, do a lot of the heavy lifting. And then you just have to sort of figure out how to roll it out. And it doesn't require as much having to figure every tiny little detail out.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important if you're already struggling to get the self-discipline to start a new venture that might have a lot of question marks that are a part of it.
Oh, yeah. Platforms don't just support, they create a container for your art, for your expression, for your creativity. I think that's definitely the case. So let's talk a little bit deeper for the type geeks out there. Neurotransmitter, all the creative subtypes are chasing dopamine, which makes sense. And let's talk about those two front functions. Again, the introverted intuition, driver or dominant function, we've nicknamed it perspectives. It's the learning or information gathering function. And then the extroverted thinking or effectiveness function is decision-making, auxiliary or co-pilot. How are these attuned in that analytic or holistic framework?
So the first function of introverted intuition or perspectives, that stays analytic. That still has that focus, that strong future orientation, kind of sort of pushing out and not taking as much in the peripheral, but really hyper-focusing on what's coming and moving its energy out. But the extroverted thinking or effectiveness function now takes on a more holistic frame. It's a little bit more open. It's a little less insistent on how everything has to be done, right? And because of that, it ends up being, it's not as domineering in its energy. And it's not as insistent in its energy of how something has to happen. So that's one of the reasons why the creative subtype ends up being more freeform, because the judging function, extroverted thinking, doesn't have as strong of a push out energy or frame.
Not as much intention behind it. Let's talk about the normalizing subtype. Let's get to the third one here. So INTJs that are normalizing. Now, these INTJs we might find in maybe more traditional careers. Unlike the creative, which is going to be more free-form, chasing the creative things, figuring it as they go, this is more likely to be the INTJ that picks a path that maybe is a little more proven and goes down that road.
Yeah, I find the description of normalizing INTJs and actually harmonizing INTJs to be very interesting. I think it probably helps answer some big mysteries around mistypes when it comes to INTJ specifically. But a normalizing subtype is going to be the most culturally or cognitively normal of these types, right? They're going to seem the most normal. They're going to seem the most usual. And oftentimes they come from conventional backgrounds, more collectivist or conventional backgrounds. They're still quirky, though. They're still INTJs. And so they might show up or look like everybody else, but they're not going to be like everybody else. They're still going to have that weird sort of, introverted intuition leading. If you're more into cognitive functions, if you're a type geek, they're still going to have that flavor about them. In Linda Barron's vernacular, they are more chart the course style. And some of the characteristics is that they are linear, reflective, analytic. They process information one step at a time in a rational way. So they're a little slower, a little more deliberate, a little bit more thoughtful, and very linear, particularly if they're male. Female INTJs will share the same characteristics, but it's even more pronounced in male INTJs that have that strong, linear, deductive style. They are more likely to come from a background with less education, interestingly enough. And that's part of the reason why they might have trended towards normalizing. If they come from a less educated or lower profile career background, they will sometimes have a difficulty, or how do I say this? They're kind of at odds with their background. It's almost like their background was a little too staid for them.
Are they rejecting it? Is that too harsh of a word?
No, it's not a rejection. It's a withdrawal.
Okay.
And so these INTJs have a tendency to be the most introverted of the INTJs in general. And they are probably going to be the most likely to identify with sensor preferences. So I suspect that a lot of normalizing INTJs may believe that they are, ISTJs. And in large part because they're trying to sort of navigate their way through a world that didn't give them a lot of resources, right? It didn't give them an opportunity to be as creative, and it didn't give them an opportunity to be as high-minded. Like if they come from a lower profile background, or if they come from a less educated background, the insistence would probably be more on, let's get through the day, right? It'll be more about practical things. And so they're going to have been taught to think in ways that are more practical. If they really didn't gel with their background, they're going to be very pronouncedly introverted and have even more so of a withdrawal energy. If they kind of gelled with their background, didn't have too much of a push away from it, then their thinking is just going to be very even and across. And so they might not be quite as introverted. They might have a little bit more extroversion in them or capacities in them because they didn't feel as much of a need to withdraw from their environment. But if there is a strong disagreement between the person, the individual, and the background they came from, they might get real caught in their heads and have a hard time interfacing with other people. And that, of course, will impact the career choices that they make, and it will impact whether or not they are able to gain reward for their hard work. So it's important to understand that if you're somebody with INTJ preferences that really did not gel with your background, but you felt the need to settle down, be safe and secure, get a good job, right, in order to make up for that lack of sense of, survival, then and if you struggle to discover your best fit type, it may be that you're simply a normalizing INTJ.
Well, and one of the things that can really be powerful for this style of INTJ is to, have your normal career that you're doing, but that quirky, weird, intuitive part of you needs some hobbies, needs some friends to talk with, needs some people to have those bizarre, abstract conversations around. Most INTJs that are normalizing subtypes benefit from some intuitive-minded friends and context that they can express themselves outside of work and tap into part of that it means so much to them. I think that's the fuel that allows them to be normalizing.
Well, and they're the opposite of creative. Whereas creative is always trying to merge hobbies and career, normalizing usually has a very distinctive delineation between those two worlds.
Yeah.
And so it's even more important as hobbyists to have something that's feeding their intuitive side. That said, some of the other characteristics that come up with these INTJs is that they're more in tune with their senses, possibly for reasons we already mentioned or for other reasons. They're more patient with details and analyzing details than other INTJs. They're more likely to be well socialized, right? They don't reject small talk as much. They can, sort of kick up a conversation with anybody about anything that's interesting. And so even though they may be more quote unquote introverted than the other INTJs, they might have a better time socializing than other INTJs.
Yeah.
Kicking up a conversation at the county fair or kicking up a conversation with somebody at the local shop, and just being sort of interested in what the other person's interested in, which is unique for the type. They're also particularly visual. So remember, the dominant is more auditory, the creative is visual, and the normalizing is also quite visual. And so they enjoy things that are reflective. They do a lot of internal sorting, and they do that through visualizations, right? When they go inside and go introspective. They also tend to be very smart, careful managers. So they also have that hard-won executive capacity. And even though it's not necessarily super fun for them, unlike the creative subtype that has a tendency to reject it and struggle with self-discipline, this is the kind that have pushed through, and they don't have as much of a challenge with that.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the careers they might choose.
Oh, and they're also the ones, just like dominants, they're not as tuned into brainstorming, unlike the creative INTJ. Okay, so considering all of that, again, these are not necessarily comprehensive lists, but they give you an idea of what creates this wiring style, the subtype style. Or they are the ones that might be most attractive to somebody with this subtype. We have on the list financial planner, quality assurance manager, logistics coordinator, technical writer, compliance officer, environmental planner, operations analyst, database administrator, human resources manager, risk analyst, procurement specialist, educational administrator, industrial engineer, museum curator, and a geographical information systems or a GIS analyst. So these are the places you're going to see these kinds of INTJs. And it kind of makes sense, right? They're they're jobs that are they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
There's a stability to them. And they can show up and use that sort of carefulness, that linear thinking, that deductive reasoning, paying attention to details a little bit more than other INTJs, and a little, kind of able to tap into a bit of that managerial capacity.
Procurement specialist. That means I get stuff.
Yeah, right.
Procurement specialist.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about the brain wiring. Let's go a little deeper here. So the two cognitive functions again, the driver or dominant is introverted intuition. We've nicknamed it perspectives. That's how INTJs learn information, perceive the world. But they make decisions with their auxiliary or co-pilot function of extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. It's about what's the result, about making decisions to output something in the real world, metrics, resource, all of that. Mm-hmm. So as we talk about the attunement of these two functions in the personality type, analytic versus holistic, how are these two functions attuned?
So it's going to be the opposite of the creative. And so when we look at introverted intuition or perspectives, it now takes on a more holistic feel. It's more receptive and open, which is why we didn't mention this before, but it's why INTJs of this subtype are usually pretty open to a lot of stuff, more than one would think, right? They're sometimes it's a little threatening if they don't have a frame of reference for it, but they usually are fascinated by a wide range of things. And that's because that perceiving function of introverted intuition is open, holistic, more receptive energy. The auxiliary function or co-pilot of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, that now has flipped from the creative, and now that is the more assertive energy. That's the analytic, more focused and certain energy of how things should be set up, how things should be done, how they should be arranged, and that's what creates this the normalizing dynamic.
Yeah. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter of choice for the normalizing subtype. And I'll make a mention of the neurotransmitters in a moment, of kind of a pattern we've noticed with them, or that was observed, I guess, in some of the brain scans and some of the other research. Let's talk about the harmonizing, the final subtype for INTJs. We've talked about the dominant. We've talked about the creative. We've talked about the normalizing. Now, what does the harmonizing INTJ subtype look like?
Okay, so this is a very interesting subtype with an already interesting type. And so to describe a harmonizing INTJ almost requires an explanation of their brain wiring. Unlike the other subtypes where you can talk about their character traits and their characteristics, and this is not uncommon when you get to the harmonizing subtypes of most of the types, they're so particular and peculiar to the individual that it's easier to understand based on how their brain is wired than specific traits that come up for them.
Yeah, and we've seen the scans. It's really interesting to see some of the brain scans Dario's shown us on the EEG, because there's some, not things missing, but there's just things aren't connecting in the same way. They're more specialized.
Exactly. So there are still some characteristics though. So these INTJs are the most eccentric and eclectic of their type. They're also the most values or principle based of the INTJs and the most out there. Okay. So they're going to be just a little, when I mentioned iconoclastic before, now times it by 10. All right. These are people who are very peculiar to their own brain wiring. They live out their unique philosophy and desires. And if you look at Linda Barron's vernacular, they have a more behind the scenes quality. Observant and driven, yet also tolerant and not pushing themselves onto other people. So here's where I get a little technical. Their brains rely on one or more diamond-shaped networks that bridge the hemispheres. So each network that these diamond-shaped networks, each network includes 4 to 6 diverse brain regions that work in concert. These multiple networks tend to not overlap. Each does its own thing and represents a different mode, and each mode fits a different kind of situation or way of thinking or being. Each mode includes a diverse set of skills that link and harmonize a thematic set of values, behavior, speech, perception, feeling, analysis, and so on. The reason why this is really important is that if an INTJ, a harmonizing INTJ, enters a situation that they lack a mode for, their behavior is usually odd or non-reactive, almost like they don't know what to do about it because it doesn't fit in one of these diamond-shaped patterns that are highly specialized. That said, they can connect all of these diamond-shaped patterns with a starburst effect. So that brainstorming capacity, you can cross-pollinate these specialties. But if something falls outside of the specialties, the INTJ is just not 100% sure what to do about that. So they just kind of get non-reactive, or maybe possibly even if their younger versions melt down. But this is the limitation of the harmonizing INTJ, while at the same time they usually have a lot of sophistication. So you're trading out the capacity to deal with general things to be highly specialized and very sophisticated in the specialties. They also have no halo effect. So I haven't really talked about this with all the other types, but a halo effect is almost like it's like the outside or ring around your brain lights up for very normal things. And it's called the halo effect. It means you're basically generally socialized. It gives you a capacity to deal with the normal things that life throws at you. And INTJs that are harmonizing almost have an anti-halo effect, like no ring shows up. It's as if typical forms of linear thinking are actively excluded. So unlike the normalizing INTJ that's very linear in their thinking, the harmonizing INTJ really struggles with linear thought unless it falls into one of these diamond-shaped networks. So if they're specialized in it, they're fine. If they're not specialized in it, they really struggle to do kind of almost basic stuff.
Yeah, let's talk briefly before we go into some more of the topical stuff. Let's go ahead and talk about the attunement of the functions, because I have a pattern that I'm picking up on here, or a comment I want to make. So let's talk about, again, driver, dominant, introverted intuition, perspectives, co-pilot, auxiliary of extroverted thinking, effectiveness, information gathering, decision making. How are these functions attuned for the harmonizing INTJ?
So this is opposite of the dominant, and therefore both of the functions are holistic. That means they're both receptive, both diffused energy, both kind of a more slow, even-keeled vibe. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm glad we anchored that, because I want to make a distinction here, because I think something was forming in my head a little bit that I kind of separated out. Analytic doesn't mean specialized, and specialized doesn't mean analytic. In fact, a holistic framed cognitive function can be very specialized. Analytic is about more of the intentionality, the energy movement, or the intentionality of the focus. than it is about the special brain patterns that are being formed in the brain. So again, it's more of what you're doing rather than how you're wired. And so I think that distinction is important, because I was starting to think in terms of, maybe analytic is a little bit more, because we talk about the analytic extroverted thinking effectiveness process being analytic for the normalizing. So I'm like, they're very specialized. They know what they like. They know what they think. They know how things go. They've got all these templates in place. So they're specialized in their brain. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means they have intentionality toward those things. It doesn't mean that that is how their brain is wired.
Yeah, actually, it might be the opposite. A more holistic, introverted intuition might be a little bit more specialized.
Yeah.
As opposed to the massive creativity of the holistic or the analytic version that you see in the creative INTJ, which is all over the place.
Yeah.
So there might be some of there. We could even talk about that and kind of dive a little further down into that. That said, going back to these INTJs, the harmonizing, unlike some other harmonizing subtypes, these INTJs still have a strong drive to complete goals. So not every harmonizing subtype is driven, but these INTJs are. So that's also what makes them unique amongst the harmonizing subtypes.
From other types.
From other types that
the
are
other
harmonizing.
15 types that are harmonizing might be different. The INTJ is very specific in that they are driven, even if they're harmonizing.
Yep. And forming and pursuing tasks in service of their goals takes little effort.
Yeah.
So they're a little bit more driven. They have a little bit more executive capacity than maybe some of the other harmonizing types. But staying open, whereas other harmonizing subtypes are usually pretty good at staying open, these INTJ harmonizers can sometimes struggle to stay open because their brain wiring is already so complex. So it's a hyper complexity of thoughts that doesn't leave a lot of space for
interoperability.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost kind of like they're odd ducks because they think in this hyper specialized way. And when new information comes in, now they have to figure out how to put it into these already overly complex ways of thinking. So these harmonizing INTJs, like most of the harmonizing subtypes, they're usually older, right? They have had time to create these special diamond-shaped patterns. They're usually at least in their 40s and 50s, if not older. And this is just a direction they went. They just figured some stuff out and they kind of doubled down on it. And this is now how they think. And they're not always, unlike the normalizing INTJs that are very socialized and sociable, these are the INTJs that might really struggle to be casually sociable. They might have figured out, and part of their diamond-shaped structure is how to socialize, right? Like they might have figured some of those pieces out. And so they have like a way of interacting in different social situations. But if they run into one that they haven't already figured out, that might be a moment when they shut down.
Okay, let's talk about some of the careers that might be patterns of this subtype.
So again, this is not a complete list, but these are the kinds of careers that might help a person move into a harmonizing role. Independent researcher, philosophy professor, social or political activist, ethical hacker, experimental artist, inventor, sustainability consultant, nonprofit founder or director, futurist, alternative medicine practitioner, independent filmmaker, author or novelist, astrobiologist, think tank analyst, or cultural anthropologist.
Yeah. A lot of humanities, a lot of empathy type careers, helping other people. Notice some of those careers also are one-to-one careers where you're dealing with one person at a time in a certain like clinical way or just consulting with somebody.
Or all by yourself.
By yourself, yeah.
Right, yeah, like analyzing things all by yourself, figuring out a whole bunch of stuff completely alone.
Yeah.
And that's, again, for the quadrant of harmonizing, right? Because if you think of these as like 4 different quadrants, they're unusual even within that quadrant from other types that share harmonizing preferences.
My guess, and also observable pattern based on us working with different personality types, ISFPs, INFPs, INFJs could be misreads. Like you might type out, and there's maybe others as well, but I could see this subtype, the harmonizing INTJ, typing out maybe like as an INFJ, for example, that shamanistic kind of like empathy, looking more like a feeler than a thinker.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, we talked about the creative INTJ benefiting from a platform, like something like YouTube where you can plug yourself into, or Uber, or something that can give you both support and container. With the harmonizing, one of the things that we've seen with clients is a harmonizing subtype having another person helping to put them forward, market them, if you will, showcase their talent. Because if the harmonizing subtype is kind of recluse and has a specialty, sometimes the interoperability isn't there for the world to see that specialty. And so another person that can champion you, and if you're this subtype, say, look, person over here, harmonizing subtype INTJ, man, they've got some really great things to offer in this empathetic frame, or this coach or this consulting frame, or whatever, bringing forward. So maybe you're not looking as much for a platform as you are looking for people that you can connect with, both to nurture yourself, but also to help put yourself out there. They can be champions for you and can be the vocal piece to get you in front of the people that need to benefit from the skills you bring.
Yeah, exactly. This kind of INTJ is going to be taking a meta perspective as much as humanly possible. So mundane considerations can be a little more challenging. Again, it depends on what modes that they have picked up. So it's so hard to talk about characteristics of this type because it kind of depends on the thing they decided to specialize in.
Yeah.
That said, because they're taking such a meta perspective most of the time, it's harder to do the more mundane things. And so having a network of people who've got your back and help you out through all of that, I think is a smart play.
Yeah. The neurotransmitter of choice is estrogen. And what's interesting, and we mentioned this on a few other of the career podcast, is there tends to be a neurotransmitter clustering effect that happens in these quadrants, or attractive effect. So, for example, the dominant testosterone-driven subtypes, and this is across all subtypes, by the way, not just INTJs. This is a pattern, but this applies to INTJs. Dominant subtypes, no matter what personality type you are, tend to be attracted to and want to spend time around harmonizing subtypes of any of the 16 personalities in the Myers-Briggs system. So if you're a dominant INTJ and you find yourself, attracted to want to be friends with or connection with maybe a harmonizing ESFP, like that would make sense because you're attracted, the testosterone and estrogen are attracted to each other. When we get into the creative though, the dopamine chasers, the creatives, tend to be attracted to other creative subtypes, again, across all types. And the normalizing serotonin focused people, they also are clustered around, like to spend time with people of like minds that are also serotonin wired normalizing. They don't like to cross over as much. So you're going to see in a creative world, a lot of creatives, no matter their personality types, clustering together, a lot of normalizing serotonin chasers clustering together, and then estrogen and testosterone dominant and harmonizing, often attracted toward each other. Again, outside of romance or anything like that, it's just these attractors tend to influence us. So you can look around at the people that you associate with too. If you're trying to find out what kind of subtype am I? Well, are you attracted to other people of like minds? Maybe you're seeing a clustering of your subtype creatively, let's say, or maybe I'm a creative. I'm around a lot of creative subtypes. Maybe that's where I'm at right now in my life. The other thing that we can talk about is not only does the way you're naturally wired, like let's say you're an INTJ, you're an INTJ, you're an INTJ. It's the song, the musical notes on the sheet. Each of these subtypes is a performance of your INTJ nature. It's an expression of how you are as an INTJ showing up. So it's just the flavoring. It doesn't mean your wiring is different. They're not static. They can shift and change over time. So you can lean into the different aspects of yourself and you can be more one of these subtypes than you were before. Now, the ability to do that, though, requires you to grow and develop the other aspects of either the analytic or the holistic attunement of your functions. Not only do your natural proclivities indicate which career you choose, but also which career you choose will start to wire you toward the subtype that career lends itself to. So if you're a dominant INTJ and you pick a creative career, you're going to start becoming more expressed as a creative subtype. And the other thing is you can't jump, right? You want to talk about you can't jump the quadrants?
Well, it's much more difficult to go sort of what is that? Diagonally than it is across, down, or up. So if you imagine these as 4 quadrants with dominant in the top left, creative in the top right, normalizing in the bottom left, and harmonizing in the bottom right, It's much easier for, say, a normalizing INTJ to visit either harmonizing or dominant. Or when I say visit, I mean like develop those qualities and characteristics over time.
Yeah.
Than it is to go from normalizing to creative. And usually you have to travel through one of those. And when you look at the either analytic or holistic preference for the functions that you're using the most, then it makes sense that you're going to primarily focus on expanding the territory of one or the other at the same time and not both. That's a heavy lift, right?
Yeah.
If you're changing your introverted intuition or perspective preference from analytic to holistic, and the same thing with extroverted thinking from holistic to analytic. It's hard to do those things simultaneously. So usually a way to get to the other side of the diagonal is through the corners, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're dominant that would like to experience harmonizing, well, do you want to get through, there through creative, or do you want to get there through normalizing? Which one do you want to work on first? And it's not uncommon for people to say that they identify with all 4 subtypes. If you're at an age where you've had a lot of careers, you've had a lot of experience, you've done a lot of things in your life, you probably have dipped into all 4 of those at some point. You've had to bring those qualities and characteristics up just to survive or respond to the environment. So over time, I think we do, unless our situation or circumstances are limiting or really force us to stay in a lane.
Yeah.
I think most of the time, there's at least a couple of those subtypes that we identify with and can track through a timeline. I think I was a little bit more creative during that time period in my life. Or maybe when I had this job, I was in my more dominant energy. That's very common for people to have that experience. I think what's nice about this information, though, is if we're missing some characteristics or qualities that we'd like to have, and they are actually natural to us, they just require us to use our functions in a slightly different way, then we can choose a career path, or maybe even hobbies, the things that we'd like to do that are more in alignment with those qualities and characteristics, and our brain wiring will follow, right? Like we'll find ourselves building the traits we need in order to match the position. Yeah. And now we gain those qualities and characteristics. It's not to say that it's easy. It's usually a stretch, but that's what growth is. And so knowing how these dynamics show up can help us make smarter choices, right? If I want to get more gain, more return on investment for my hard effort, maybe as a creative INTJ, I need to dip into or start visiting a more dominant space, because dominant INTJs tend to do a little better financially. So maybe I need to get that under my belt. Otherwise, I'm leaving money on the table, both literally and figuratively. And so maybe I need to step into that for a while. Or maybe I have entered a space where I need to be more harmonizing, right? Like I need to be more of a specialist and really figure some things out. And maybe I'm using it in a career that's more designed for counseling or, psychoanalysis or therapy. Maybe that's the time or a space I need to enter for a while to figure some stuff out. It gives a map. It gives waypoints or maybe lily pads along the path where I go, okay, I think this is what's next for me. And now I'm not flying blind. Now I can watch myself go through all of these cycles in life and develop some of the characteristics and traits that are available to me or to the person listening as an INTJ that they might not have known is actually natural to their type.
Yeah. So I think we'd love to hear from you. You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone, but you've been the third person in this conversation. And you've heard us talk about these 4 subtypes for INTJ. Which one do you identify with? Or maybe there's a couple. Maybe you have a journey through all 4 of them. Maybe you're a little bit later in life and you've matured and you found yourself landing on one, but you've watched yourself through career choices and lifestyle choices go through a bunch of different energies. We'd love to hear what that was like for you. And I think our community would love to hear it too. So come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story, your INTJ story of your career path, maybe where you are in your career now or where you've come from or where you're hoping to be in the future. Stories are great ways to compress experience for the rest of us to learn from you and understand where you're coming from. We can add our comments and get a conversation started around the INTJ career path that can help you and other people that are part of that convo. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
I realized that we said earlier that the dominant INTJ is the one that's more auditory. So I wonder if, because this is a podcast,
Get all dominants.
we'll get a bunch of dominant INTJs showing up. But we are also on YouTube now, so the visuals can show up too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if a lot of people, just as a general thing, on YouTube are more creatively bent because they're more visual focused as a subtype. And wonder if different platforms cluster certain subtypes.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I'm sure, like auditory podcasting probably clusters a certain subtype, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I bet we have more dominant and possibly harmonizing. I wonder if the harmonizing, I don't have a note on whether or not they trend towards visual or auditory, but my suspicion is that harmonizings usually trend towards auditory.
Hearing people's stories, especially INTJs.
Yeah, so I bet we'll get a bunch of those, but I don't know. Maybe we'll see. So that said, we will make sure that there is a link for Dr. Dario Nardi's work that we have very heavily leaned upon because that's been the basis of a lot of this understanding, and particularly considering the realization how much our careers impact our brain wiring. That's a no-brainer. Why didn't I think of that? But obviously that would be the case since we spend so much time there and it asks so much of us in problem solving and environmental responsiveness. So we've learned a lot on Dario's work around that, and we're very grateful. So we'll make sure to put a link. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a video podcast on YouTube. You might be watching us right now. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can like it, subscribe to us for future episodes, and you can hit the little bell that lets you know when a new episode comes out. And of course, you can also leave a comment. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it on all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And if we have just really blown your mind and you're trying to figure out do I have INTJ preferences? You might have already thought you did and now you're questioning, or vice versa. You've listened to this podcast and you went, wait, could I be an INTJ? You can head over to personalityhacker.com and take our free online assessment to help you in your journey to find your best fit type.
Yeah. At the end of that assessment, if you are an INTJ, you're going to find a resource called the INTJ Owner's Manual. It's not an owner's manual you just buy and have. It's designed to help you create an owner's manual for your life. Not just the pathway of where you're going, but who you are and how you're wired and how those two interface with each other. The person that is you as the INTJ, and then navigating the path and the life that you want to create. We've got tons of programs and products all designed to help you on your journey. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. Hey, it's Joel from Personality Hacker. So a big reason people get into personality types is usually to improve their relationships with other people. And you can understand key differences between you and someone else when you understand how type works. So clearly, personality type is applied to relationships, but what about the relationship with yourself? Well, personality type can also help you navigate your career, or maybe an educational path that you need to follow, or other opportunities that present themselves, and it helps you know which are the right choice for you. And ultimately, personality is the key to unlocking identity-level worldview and life purpose. It all starts with getting the owner's manual for your personality type. In this owner's manual, we cover the basics of your personality, and then we dive a layer deeper to connect your personality to your relationships, your career, your worldview, and identity, because we believe it's your life, and it should be designed for your personality. So start your owner's manual journey at personalityhacker.com. When you access your owner's manual, I recommend focusing on the ideal day exercise first, because when you start crafting your ideal day, you're being mindful about the type of lifestyle that you want. So designing a life around how you're naturally wired makes sense, and you can finally stop fighting yourself. So come discover and develop your unique personality at personalityhacker.com.